Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into one of the most intense and unexpected moments to ever happen on late night television. What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected icons comes face to face with a host known for his sarcasm and smug humor? You're about to find out. This is Clint Eastwood versus Jimmy Kimmel. And trust me, it's not just awkward, it's unforgettable. The episode started like any other evening. The lighting was intense, the crowd was abuzz, and the tension in the air was palpable. And then Clint Eastwood came on stage. At 94, he didn't come in, and he took over the room. His stature was imposing, as if he had just walked out of one of his timeless westerns. The audience exploded in cheers, excited to witness a living legend in person. But below the surface, something didn't sit quite right. Perhaps it was Kimmel's smile that seemed just a tad too staged, or perhaps it was the way his monologue had subtly poked fun at older Hollywood icons. Either one, the atmosphere was already turning. Eastwood took his seat slowly, deliberately, every movement serene and calculated. He straightened his jacket, glared Jimmy in the eyes, and nodded minutely. The sort of nod that conveyed, "I'm ready." Kimmel welcomed him with his characteristic bright voice, saying, "Clint Eastwood, everyone. Thanks for coming. I have to say that you look great for your age." The crowd laughed, but Eastwood remained expressionless. "Well," he replied flatly, "I'm still breathing. That's something." It was old Clint, dry, plain, and cutting. Kimmel rolled his eyes and shot back, "That's more than can be said about most of your actors." The audience laughed, but the next line stung. "You've been rather quiet of late on politics," Kimmel said. "Not like you used to be, yakking away at empty chairs." The nod to Eastwood's 2012 Republican National Convention speech was not subtle. The room tightened up in an instant. Clint's smile dissipated and his eyes lidded slightly to indicate he was finished playing nice. "I thought I'd leave chair talking to the experts," Eastwood responded icily, "though I see you've gotten quite skilled at speaking to yourself." Some people laughed uncomfortably. Kimmel's face compressed, but he continued, "Hey, that's what they pay me for. But in all seriousness, don't you think it's time for your generation to move over? Let younger voices have a turn. Hollywood's changing. Perhaps some of the old-fashioned notions need to change as well." Eastwood didn't budge. He simply glared back, utterly immobile. It was the sort of immobility that didn't result from advancing age. It resulted from assurance, from experience, from knowing the right thing to say. Then he did speak. "You see, Jimmy, I've been directing films since before you were born. I've worked with the best. I've done award-winning films. I've done stories that people still remember 40 years from now. So when you're speaking of stepping down, I need to ask, what have you done to make you the one to propose that?" The studio was silent. This wasn't entertainment any longer. This was serious. Kimmel's face turned red. He attempted to recover. "Well, I have a rather successful talk show," he had to say, but it fell flat. Clint inclined forward. "It's easy to host a talk show. You just sit in a chair and you talk. Creating something that'll last, that requires vision, that requires courage, that requires discipline. Something you don't learn from telling jokes." The crowd didn't know what to do. The vibe had totally changed. What began as a lighthearted interview ended as a lesson in presence, power, and respect. Clint Eastwood didn't just stand his ground. He reminded the entire room exactly why he's a legend. This was not merely a clash of generations. It was an awakening. A wake-up call to the realization that legacy is not something you play at, but something you achieve. What happens when you combine bravado with genuine experience? Sarcasm with substance? You have a television moment that people won't soon forget. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Because next time, we'll be unpacking even more moments that shook Hollywood to its core. And remember, never underestimate someone who's been quietly winning longer than you've been in the game. Kimmel attempted to steady the moment, his own voice holding a slight tinge of defensiveness. "We've won some awards, you know. We've got millions of viewers." Eastwood raised an eyebrow and answered, "Congratulations," his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've really nailed the art of reading jokes written by other people while interviewing guests far more talented than yourself. Quite the legacy." The studio tension had switched from uncomfortable to charged. You could sense it on the other side of the screen. Somewhere off camera, Kimmel's producers were likely sweating bullets, but the host, his ego wounded, leaned forward rather than backed away. "You know what, Clint?" he snapped. "Perhaps this whole tough guy who is superior to everyone else thing, perhaps that's the issue. Don't you think that's a little in the past? Times have modified. People demand real now, not some 1970s cowboy act." Eastwood's jaw snapped shut, barely. He shifted his head from the side, as if weighing whether or not the next few words were worth it. When he did speak, his voice fell even further, a silent, deadly composure. "Cowboy routine," he repeated slowly. "Son, I've been shot at with real bullets. Not just the kind that come from behind a keyboard. I've worked 16-hour days in 100-degree heat, making films that actually meant something. I've employed thousands, helped launch careers, and told stories that mattered. And you sit in a climate-controlled studio, behind a desk, throwing jokes at people who've done the hard work. So go ahead. Tell me again about authenticity." Kimmel's confidence broke visibly. His quick wit, usually fast and unbreakable, seemed to disappear. The crowd had gone dead silent. Some stared with their mouths open, as if they were watching a slow-motion car crash. It was awkward. It was raw. And nobody could turn away. Still grasping at the interview, Kimmel took a stumble. "Look, I'm just saying. Perhaps some of these old-school Hollywood guys need to acknowledge that the business has changed. Perhaps it's time to move on from the past. We can't continue to applaud antiquated notions of masculinity. That kind of poisonous energy. It's just not what people want anymore." Eastwood's face didn't even move, but his tone, smooth, measured, sliced through the air like a knife. "Toxic masculinity," he repeated, the words slow and slicing. "Is that what you say now? When a man arrives, takes ownership, does the work, and doesn't have to tear other people down to feel relevant? No laughter, no applause, only silence." A mere nod from Eastwood spoke volumes more than any joke could ever. Kimmel was desperate by now, looking for an exit from the confrontation, but Eastwood had not finished. "You want to discuss evolution?" he said. "All right, let's discuss. There was once when performers had to possess genuine talent. They had to sing, or dance, or act. They had to present something authentic to the table, something worthwhile to observe. Nowadays, you can construct an entire career reading tweets, mug for the camera, and reuse recycled jokes. That is not progress. That is deterioration. The blood ran from Kimmel's face. The man who had made a reputation for himself, always getting the last word, now sat with nothing to utter. And then he did the ultimate mistake of the night. "You know what, Clint?" Kimmel snapped, his tone slightly raised. "Perhaps you're just resentful that Hollywood passed you by. When was the last time you directed a movie that anyone under 30 watched? Rather than telling me about talent, perhaps you might try remaining relevant, because it seems the industry's already passed you by." The words lingered in the air like smoke after a shot. Even the camera crew paused. The room did not breathe. Clint Eastwood did not flinch immediately. He simply gazed, unflinching, with those frozen blue eyes that had brought silence to outlaws and presidents alike. And that's when everything changed. Eastwood did not blink. His voice had fallen so low that the audience leaned forward just to hear each word. "Pass me by?" he repeated, almost amused. Then he leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between them without moving an inch. "Jimmy, my last movie took over $200 million at the global box office. It was shortlisted for 6 Academy Awards. And here's the joke. Your show, this one here, 2 million viewers on a good night. My films, the ones you claim nobody under the age of 30 is watching, they're still in cinemas. Still popular on streaming services. Folks all over the world are still discovering them, still quoting them, still being moved by them." Kimmel opened his mouth, trying to jump in, but Eastwood raised a single finger. "Just one." It was quiet, commanding, and it stopped Jimmy mid-sentence. "I'm not done," Eastwood said, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "You want to talk about relevance? I've been making films for over 50 years. I've lived through every trend, every wave of change in this industry. I've watched Hollywood come up, go down, and do it all over again. And in all of it, I've remained committed to one thing. I don't follow what's trendy. I make what counts. You, however, you're the result of marketing sessions, focus groups, studio executives, dictating what you need to say and how." He leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on Kimmel's. "So, when you mention authenticity, listening to that from you is like a puppet scolding a carpenter on craftsmanship." The studio fell silent as white. No one was brave enough to budge. Even the cameramen were motionless, trapped in the intensity of the moment. Kimmel was visibly unraveling, but pride pushed him to keep going. "That's a nice speech, Clint," he said with a forced laugh. "But let's be honest, you're from a different era, and that era had a lot of problems. The way women were treated, the lack of diversity, the whole boys' club mentality. Maybe some of those traditions needed to die out." Eastwood's expression turned cold. This was no longer about ego now. It was personal. "Boys' club?" he said again, not much louder than a whisper, but more menacing than any yell. "Jimmy, I've worked with some of the toughest women in this industry. I've directed women to Oscar nominations. I've produced female-led movies when no one else in the studio system would touch them. I've hired women in every department, camera, sound, editing, production, you name them. Tell me, what have you done for women in entertainment, other than making jokes about how they look and treating them like scenery on your set?" Kimmel's mouth dropped open and snapped shut. He resembled a man looking for a parachute during a fall. "And diversity?" Eastwood went on, raising his voice just enough to bear the weight. "I was telling stories with diverse casts when your greatest challenge was whether you were going to get chosen to play dodgeball or not. I've directed movies about all sorts of people, from all sorts of backgrounds. And I treated those stories with respect. You mock those who don't sound like you, think like you, or look like you. And then you make it a joke and label it as progress. Nobody budged. Even the production assistants had frozen in place. The room seemed to be holding its breath. Kimmel was backed into a corner, no longer confident performer, but man-stripped of accustomed control. He roamed his eyes past every door, as if mentally logging each route for possible escape. But there was none to be had. Then Eastwood leaned in once again, voice cold and biting. "Know what your actual issue is, Jimmy? You've never made something that wasn't given to you by a room full of writers and producers. You've never taken an actual chance. Never put your name, your face, your reputation on something that was important. You're a middleman, standing on the shoulders of men who actually built something from scratch." He stood there, allowing the words to take effect. Next time you feel the need to lecture me about being behind the times, he reminded her, remember with whom you're speaking. I'm not a throwback. I am a reminder of what this business once required and what it still must. It was as if hearing a karaoke performer deconstruct Frank Sinatra's singing technique. Kimmel finally spoke up, but it sounded thinner, and a little higher than it normally did, cracking ever so slightly. Hey, that's not right. I work hard at this job. I work long hours. I care about this show. Eastwood's mouth smiled. Not up, but something nastier. Hard work? He repeated, almost with incredulity. Son, hard work is waking up at 4 a.m. to pursue a shot because the light is only ideal for 10 minutes. Hard work is repeating the same scene time and time again when your knees are shot and your back hurts like hell. But the story dictates it. Hard work is seeing the whole crew, families, mortgages, dreams ahead, relying on you to bring something that counts. He paused a moment. You read cue cards and react to clap signs. That's not hard work, Jimmy. That's high-level babysitting. There was a buzz in the crowd now, people squirming in their seats. This was not the good-natured tension of an E-interview that had gone a little too far. This was something else, something more. Kimmel's producers were probably yelling in his earpiece, but the host sat locked up, unable to navigate the vessel he was hired to command. Look, you want to know what's really old-fashioned? Eastwood said, his voice calm but charged. It's this notion that knocking people down is going to make you seem smarter. It's this shallow trick that sarcasm is intelligence, that if you can make fun of it, you necessarily comprehend it. That's not wisdom, Jimmy. That's laziness in a tuxedo, and proclaiming it witty. Kimmel, visibly shaken, attempted one final gambit. All right. Let's take a deep breath here. This is all supposed to be fun, isn't it? Folks watch to have a laugh, not to see some angry old coot complain about the old days. The words stung like a slap. Eastwood's face set in a hard grimace, his jaw tightening. The whole room felt like it dropped 10 degrees for a second. Angry old man, he said slowly again. The voice in his tone was no longer veiled. It was flame and ice, steel under rocks. Jimmy, I am not angry. Angry is when somebody cuts you off on the road. What I am experiencing at the moment is disappointment. He stopped, allowing the gravity of the word to sink in. Disappointment that a man of your stature, your platform, would go about wasting it being a condescending clown. You have the potential to feature actual stories, actual people, actual achievements. You have the potential to shed light and not cast shadows. But you don't. You sit here night after night feeling big by lowering others. And you call that entertainment? He shook his head, the final judgment. That's not entertainment, Jimmy. That's just sad. The word hung in the air like a gavel coming down. Sad. Kimmel's face had lost its color. His once red face of embarrassment had turned pale, with something nearer to humiliation. And then it occurred. The moment desperation gave way to venom. His voice, when he spoke, was biting, petulant. A child caught red-handed, too proud to confess. Know what's pathetic, Clint? Seeing someone who once mattered, struggling to stay relevant by preaching to people about how things ought to be. Perhaps if you'd cease to cling to the past and make an effort to see the world as it is, rather than as you imagine it to be, you'd see your entire cowboy-hatted, toxic masculinity, so-called tough guy routine for what it truly is. The silence that ensued was stifling. Even the air conditioning was held breathless. It was that kind of silence which did not encourage response. It forced one. Clint Eastwood blinked not, spoke not, sat there motionless, eyes frozen on Kimmel, as if weighing whether the fellow in front of him was even worthy of a response. The seconds ticked by, heavy, laborious seconds. And then he rose. The movement was deliberate, slow. The kind of movement that had everyone in the room sit up a little straighter, as if something significant was about to occur. He stared straight at Kimmel and spoke just loud enough to be heard. "Stand up, Jimmy!" The words weren't shouted or growled. They were in hushed tones. But somehow they resonated louder than everything else that evening. They didn't require volume. They had weight. In that moment, the audience didn't know if they were still watching a talk show or the opening scene of a showdown. Kimmel blinked, confused. "What?" "I said stand up," Eastwood repeated, more firmly this time. "If you're going to talk to me like that, you're going to do it on your feet, like a man." The studio fell, as silent as stone. This was no longer television. This was no longer show business. This was something rough, honest, and a little too close to home for the protection of a soundstage. Kimmel glanced about, scanning the room, the cameras, the crew, as if someone, anyone, could rescue him from the second he'd stepped himself into. "Clint, I think maybe we should just stand. Up." The words were tougher now. Not loud, but absolute, like a door slapping shut. Kimmel paused, then slowly stood up from his seat. And in that moment, the contrast between the two men was unignorable. Clint Eastwood, at the age of 90, towered with the gravity and serenity of a man who'd spent a lifetime standing up to worse. Kimmel, without his podium and jokes, looked precisely what he was. A man who'd never really been tested face to face. "Want to discuss toxic masculinity?" Eastwood replied, advancing toward Kimmel's desk. "Let me tell you what's truly toxic, Jimmy." "What's toxic," he said, voice steady, "is a man who builds a career, tearing down people who are better than him. What's toxic is hiding behind sarcasm because you're too afraid to say anything real. What's toxic is thinking that cruelty counts as comedy, and mockery somehow passes for meaning." Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but Eastwood raised his hand. And like before, the gesture froze the moment. "I'm not finished. You sit here night after night behind your desk, ridiculing people who actually do something. You sneer at athletes, politicians, artists, actors, people who expose themselves, people who fail in front of others, people who actually risk something. And you do it all with this smirk, as if you're superior to them. But you've never created anything, you've never risked anything, you've never failed at something that meant something." You could sense the tension in the room, breathing, coughing, the shuffling of someone attempting not to be seen. The quiet was oppressive. Eastwood moved even further forward, now nearly nose to nose with Kimmel. "Want to know what real masculinity is?" he asked, his tone increasing not in volume, but in assurance. "It's showing up, owning your words. It's respecting people, even when you disagree with them. It's building, not destroying. It's knowing when to just shut up and listen. It's owning the times when you screw up and standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves, not turning them into punchlines for ratings." Kimmel found his voice at last, but it came out in a strangled whisper. "This is my show, Clint. You can't just..." "Can't just what?" Eastwood interrupted. "Speak the truth. Stand up to a bully for what he is." He took a half step back, not in retreat, but to allow the words to hit. "You're right. This is your show. And that means what happens here. The cheap shots, the low blows, the jokes that hurt people who can't defend themselves, that's on you. Every single one. Your responsibility." The crowd had started to whisper again, but it wasn't laughter, it wasn't approval. It was unease, whispering in seats. The realization of people sitting there watching something disintegrate. And then Eastwood's voice fell once more. Low, serious, and heartbreaking. "You know what the saddest part is, Jimmy? He paused, allowing the silence to seep in. You actually had potential once. I remember seeing you years ago, Eastwood pronounced, voice low and steady. When you were hungry, when you cared about being good at this, not just being famous for it, but somewhere along the way, you made a decision. You decided that it was easier to be cruel than to be significant. You chose safe cynicism over dangerous sincerity. He waited, holding Kimmel's gaze. And that's not my generation's fault, Jimmy. That's yours. Kimmel appeared to be a man losing it. The smooth TV personality had totally snapped. Sweat shone on his forehead, and his voice was on the verge of collapse. Look, perhaps we started off on the wrong note here. Why don't we just pretend this didn't take place? Pretend this didn't happen? Eastwood echoed, his voice growing chilly. Why don't we just smile on camera, shake hands, and pretend like nothing's wrong? Is that really what you want, Jimmy? He stepped back another inch, standing directly on the edge of Kimmel's desk. The host involuntarily stepped back. Because that right there, that plastic pretend, smooth it over at all costs mindset, is precisely what's wrong with this business. No one wants true conflict. No one wants true dialogue. Everyone's so afraid of repercussions, they'd prefer to wear a mask and chuckle than be confronted with the facts. He glared at Kimmel, then inched closer. Now, here's the thing about consequences, Jimmy. They don't listen to your excuses. They don't listen to your rationalizations or your Nielsen ratings. They simply arrive. And the consequence of spending your whole career tearing people down is that one day, someone's going to tear back. He adjusted his jacket, breathed slowly, and turned to address the main camera. His tone mellowed, but contained more power than ever. Ladies and gentlemen, he started, I came here tonight to speak about my work, to tell you some stories, perhaps even make you smile. Instead, I was on the receiving end of a form of disrespect that, unfortunately, goes as entertainment these days. He paused, his eyes level and unflickering. I've said what I had to say, not only to Mr. Kimmel here, but to everybody who thinks that cruelty is the same as being smart. It's not. And I refuse to sit here and pretend otherwise. Then he glared at Kimmel one last time. You see, Jimmy, you might do well to go back and watch some of those old westerns that you think are so passe. Because in those tales, the heroes stood for something. They defended people who couldn't defend themselves. They made things, communities, values, character. You remember that word? Character. You might do well to try it sometime. And with that, Clint Eastwood left the stage. No grand finale, no over-the-top music. Just soft, deliberate footsteps of a man who didn't have to yell to make the impact. Jimmy Kimmel remained behind him, standing alone at the desk, appearing as if he'd been held up in front of a mirror and didn't particularly care for what he saw. The crowd wasn't sure whether to applaud or remain mute. Even the cameras weren't sure where to look. There was nothing more to photograph except the silent residue of a reckoning that had obviously been a long time in the making. And that is the tale of what happens when Hollywood's greatest tough guy comes into late-night TV and reduces it to its essentials. Now, it's your turn. What do you think? Was Eastwood justified in calling out Kimmel in that way? Or did he overstep? Undefined. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more real stories that cut through the noise, be sure to subscribe.